Okay, so we've spent about 45 minutes so far talking about fluids and ions, and I hope you can see why. That's because all semester long, as I showed you, when we cover the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the urinary system, when we cover acid-base balance, we'll always be talking about fluids and solutes, ions. You need to know all the fluids, you need to know where they are, you need to know all the ions, you need to know where they are, you need to know about the pressures and so on. So I tried to put all that together in one slide here for you. So remember, body is 50 to 60% fluid. For a typical 150-pound person, that's around 40 liters or 10 gallons. 2/3 of that is ICF, 1/3 is ECF. Most of the ECF is interstitial fluid. Again, interstitial fluid is 25% of your total fluid. And the rest is blood, lymph, and a few others, all right? Cell membranes enclosed by the plasma membrane. Cells enclosed by plasma membrane or phospholipid bilayer. Water, gases, small nonpolar particles, hydrophobic solutes can easily diffuse. Large hydrophilic solutes, charged solutes, and ions have to have channels and transporters. There you see salt. Salt is a solute. It completely dissolves in water. You don't see it once you put some in, as long as you put only a little bit in. Sodium-potassium pump, remember, creates all those differences in ion concentration, pumps 3 sodiums out to the ECF, 2 potassium into the ICF. Ions regulate physiological processes, act as buffers. The ECF, we've got sodium chloride bicarbonate. ICF, we've got potassium phosphate, and then the A- means protein anions. And in terms of moving water and solutes around, that's osmotic pressure. And remember, this little saying will solve almost all osmotic pressure problems and tell you where fluid is going. Water follows solutes. All right. Okay, here you go. Grab a pencil or a pen, I don't care. Write in your own blood, doesn't bother me. Suppose a person weighs 240 pounds, about how much ECF do they have? 150 pounds, 120 pounds, 85 pounds, 80 pounds, or 40 pounds. You can expect a question like this on your quiz. I will ask you to do this. You do have to be able to use numbers. You know, in nursing school, first semester, they actually have a class called Nursing Calculations. And basically what it is, it's a review of 4th grade arithmetic. You do have to know 4th grade arithmetic. So did you get the answer yet? Pause the video until you get the answer and then check. How much ECF do they have? Yeah, the answer is 40 pounds. Wait, what? All right, let's see how we do that. Remember, your total body fluid is about 50%. So if a person weighs 240, half of that is water. That means 120 pounds of fluid. All right? How much is ECF? ECF is about a third. A third of 120 is 40. All right? Not complicated. Easy. No calculus needed here. No trigonometry. Just simple numbers. Just a fraction or two. All right? You will have a question like this on your 20-point, huge, most important quiz of the entire semester. All right, we need to switch over now and start talking about the autonomic nervous system. I know you talked about this in Bio 201 because you had to. The CLOs or SLOs, whatever they call them now, at the end of the semester, for every single Bio 201 class at Pima, required you to know adrenergic and cholinergic effects. You had to know the neurotransmitters. You had to know the types of receptors. You had to know all that. So let's review it since you probably lost brain cells over the break. Let's go back and talk about a basic concept of agonists and antagonists. So a neurotransmitter, their effects can be enhanced or inhibited by drugs and toxins. So some drugs can cause you to make more neurotransmitter. Other drugs can cause you to make less. Same with toxins. Drugs, toxins, really the same thing. It's just a question of whether or not we like what they do or whether we don't. The release of neurotransmitters, some drugs can block the release. Some drugs can enhance the release. All right. Removal. Remember, neurotransmitters have to be removed from the synapse after they've been released. Well, we can either stimulate removal or we can block removal, okay? Receptor sites. Remember, neurotransmitters have to bind to receptor sites. Well, we can either block the receptor site so the neurotransmitter can't bind to it, or we can have drugs that mimic the neurotransmitter and fool the receptor into thinking that it's the neurotransmitter. So an agonist is anything that enhances the effect of a neurotransmitter. It makes more of that neurotransmitter's effect. Antagonist is anything that inhibits the action of a neurotransmitter, so it makes less of that neurotransmitter's effect. Many drugs and toxins function as either agonists or antagonists of neurotransmitters. That's what they do. All right? So let's think about this. SSRIs, you may have talked about those in Bio 201, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Those are the most common antidepressant drugs out there. Prozac, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, Paxil. Those are all SSRIs. They block the reuptake of serotonin. So what are they? Are they agonists or antagonists? Think this through. Think carefully. Are they agonists or antagonists if they block the reuptake of serotonin? Pause the video. Get your answer ready. Okay, here we go. They're agonists. Did you get that right? You got to think about it. If they block the reuptake, then what does that mean? That means that the serotonin stays in the synapse. It doesn't get removed like it's supposed to. Therefore, we have more serotonin. Therefore, we have a greater effect of serotonin. Therefore, they are agonists. Don't be fooled by words like block and inhibit. Those won't always give you the direct answer. You have to think it through. It's figure-outable. All right, let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. Remember, we had the somatic nervous system, which was for skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system controlled mostly the inside of your body, controlled your organs, all right? The autonomic nervous system is the one that regulated homeostasis, all right? It controlled all of your guts, in order to keep things in the correct balance, all right? Sympathetic division was the fight or flight, remember? Most sympathetic postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. Those are catecholamines, and we say that sympathetic receptors are adrenergic, all right? Norepinephrine and epinephrine are, and those are the main neurotransmitters. So we also then talk about adrenergic effects. We can say sympathetic effects, we can say adrenergic effects. Those mean the same thing, okay? Parasympathetic, remember, was the rest and digest. So it's the one that basically, after the sympathetic was the nervous system of crisis. Like, when the chupacabra comes through the door, you have to run, you have to fight, all right? Then after the crisis is over, after you've killed the chupacabra, you're now going to cook it and eat it. Now parasympathetic, rest and digest. Enjoy yourself, relax, you won. All right, enjoy dinner now, okay? So parasympathetic postganglionic receptors release acetylcholine. So postganglionic means at the actual organ. Remember, there were we had ganglia, all right? Ganglia are collections of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So at the preganglionic fibers, those were releasing acetylcholine. We don't really care much about those because they're the same for both sympathetic and parasympathetic. You can see in that illustration on the right. ACH is what gets released at the ganglia, and there are nicotinic receptors at the ganglia. We're not really going to care about those this semester at all. We're going to be focused on the actual organs. So see how at the bottom of that illustration it says post-ganglionic fibers? Actually, they misspelled it. It says POS, piece of shit, ganglionic fibers. But notice on the sympathetic side, it's norepinephrine. On the parasympathetic, it's acetylcholine, all right? So we say that parasympathetic receptors are cholinergic because it's acetylcholine, all right? And by the way, they are muscarinic, not nicotinic, okay? You learned that in Bio 201. You did. You had to. You were tested on it at the end of the semester. Remember then also that most body organs have dual innervation. What does that mean? It means that there's both a sympathetic nerve and a parasympathetic nerve going to the organ. Think about it. The sympathetic nervous system has to be able to speed up your heart. The parasympathetic has to be able to slow your heart down to get it back to normal. Therefore, there has to be both a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nerve going to your heart. Same with the lungs. Sympathetic nervous system opens up your lungs. Parasympathetic nervous system closes them down. Your pupils, remember, sympathetic dilates your pupils, parasympathetic constricts your pupils. All of your internal organs have both a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nerve, with one big exception, the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland gets only a sympathetic nerve, and that's because the adrenal gland dumps catecholamines into your bloodstream. So it's only a sympathetic organ. It has no parasympathetic effects. All right, so do you know these? Do you know what are adrenergic effects? You should be able to. In my Bio 201 class, I told my students they had to be able to name 5 right off the top of their head without even thinking about it. So do you remember those? Go back and think about those. Adrenergic. What does the sympathetic nervous system do to your body? And then conversely, what are cholinergic effects? And remember, when we say adrenergic effects, we mean sympathetic. When we say cholinergic effects, we mean parasympathetic. So do you remember what some of those are? They're going to be mostly the opposite of adrenergic. And then anticholinergic. Do you remember anticholinergic? Yeah, those come from blocking the parasympathetic. So they're similar to adrenergic, but not exactly the same. Are you remembering all those clearly? I'm thinking maybe some of you aren't, so let's take just a moment and go back and review. So, adrenergic or sympathetic effects. These are so easy to remember because think about crisis. Your life is in danger. The chupacabra has come through the door. Or maybe it's El Cucuy has come out of the closet. Or maybe it's La Mano Peluda. It's coming for you. Okay, so your body has to prepare for survival. What do? Pupil dilation. You need to be able to see better. You need to be able to see where La Mano Peluda is. Decreases salivation. That's because you don't need to digest right now. Saliva is for digesting. Increases perspiration. Why? Because most likely you're running and fighting and your body's going to heat up. Remember, when you make ATP, you produce heat as a byproduct. So therefore, you perspire to cool down. Bronchodilation, it opens up your lungs. It increases heart rate and contractility. Heart rate is how many times per minute your heart beats. Contractility is how forcefully, all right? In other words, the power of the contraction. Both of those are in order to get more blood to your tissues because you're trying to survive. It's going to inhibit digestion because you don't need to worry about the cheeseburger in your stomach right now. We'll digest that later. Right now, we need to survive. Glycogen, remembers the way your liver stores glucose, so it's going to convert glycogen back into glucose. Why? Because we need oxygen and glucose to make ATP in order to fight El Cucuy. So we want to have lots of glucose in the blood so the muscles and the heart and everything can get it. It's going to release renin from the kidney. You may not have talked about that in Bio 201. We're going to talk a lot about that in Bio 202. Renin is a hormone that increases blood pressure. You want to increase your blood pressure in order to get blood to your organs faster. Catecholamine released by the adrenal gland. So catecholamines, again, are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Your adrenal gland dumps those into your blood so that they go everywhere in your body. So that all your body tissues will benefit from epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's going to inhibit urination. It's going to inhibit defecation. We don't need to worry about those right now. We're surviving, okay? Peripheral vasoconstriction, so the small blood vessels out near the surface of your body, it's going to make those constrict down because that will raise blood pressure and therefore get blood to your organs faster. On the other hand, it will vasodilate the deep blood vessels going to places like your heart and your skeletal muscles and your liver because they need more blood. Your heart's working harder. It needs more blood. Remember, the heart needs oxygen and glucose too to keep itself alive, so the heart has to have its own blood supply. Skeletal muscles to run and fight. Liver in order to convert glycogen back into glucose. So a nice diagram there showing the cholinergic and adrenergic effects. So we just went over the adrenergic. Look at the cholinergic. They're kind of the opposite. Pupil constriction, increased salivation, bronchoconstriction, decreased heart rate, decreased contractility, increase digestion. It's going to turn glucose into glycogen, the opposite. We're now going to store glycogen for the next time a crisis comes around. It's also going to increase bile production. It's going to enhance urination and defecation. It's going to do peripheral vasodilation, and it's going to vasoconstrict those deep blood vessels to the heart, skeletal muscles, and liver. Instead, we need blood going to our intestines, all right? So it will increase blood supply to the intestines. So make sure you know your adrenergic and cholinergic effects. Adrenergic, same as sympathetic. Cholinergic, same as parasympathetic. Then anticholinergic. So remember what was going on here? There are lots of common prescription and over-the-counter drugs, including tricyclic antidepressants, SSRIs. Remember those selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, etc. Antipsychotics, antispasmodics, muscle relaxers, antidiarrheals, antihistamines. All those drugs can have anticholinergic effects. They normally don't if you're taking the recommended amounts, but people tend to overdose on those for a lot of reasons. I mean, think about it. You know, antihistamines. When you get a cold, you buy a bottle of Dayquil. It says to take 2 tablespoons every 4 hours. And what do? You take the bottle and you chug the damn bottle. It doesn't really make it any better, but it may, in terms of the cold, but it may cause anticholinergic effects. Depressed people, they go through a bad day. They take an extra dose of their antidepressants thinking it'll help. It doesn't, but it'll cause anticholinergic effects, and so on. All right? For various reasons, people will take too many of these, and then they get this anticholinergic syndrome. These drugs block acetylcholine receptors, primarily muscarinic receptors, including Marroquin sweat glands. So remember, that was the big exception in the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system stimulates all accessory skin structures, including those erector pili muscles and including the sweat glands. But even though the sympathetic nervous system activates Marroquin, remember Marroquin are the one that cool you down. Apocrine were the sex and stress sweat glands. Marroquin cool you down, but the sympathetic nervous system releases acetylcholine onto muscarinic receptors. That was the one huge exception. So if we block muscarinic receptors, which is what anticholinergic effects means, it means we're going to have effects similar to blocking the sympathetic nervous system. Well, remember dual innervation. You have nerves of both sympathetic and parasympathetic going to all your organs except the adrenal glands. Well, what that means is normally you have signals from parasympathetic and sympathetic going to your organs. If you suddenly block all the parasympathetic, well, the sympathetic signals are still getting through. So anticholinergic, blocking the parasympathetic, has signs and symptoms similar to parasympathetic, with the big exception that it blocks the Marroquin sweat glands, so you also can't sweat. Sweating would be sympathetic. In this case, you're blocking the Marroquin, so they can't sweat. So these drugs disrupt homeostatic balance, producing signs and symptoms that mimic sympathetic activation by inhibiting the parasympathetic. Common symptoms of overdose on these drugs include confusion and agitated behavior. That's because acetylcholine is also a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it uses muscarinic receptors. So when you have anticholinergic effects, you block a lot of brain receptors, which tends to make people confused. And think about it. What happens when people are confused? What happens when you're telling them something and they're not understanding it, and you tell them again and they still don't understand it? They start to get agitated. So confusion and agitation comes from the effects of blocking muscarinic receptors in the brain. Dilated pupils, blurred vision, flushed skin, and hyperthermia. Hyperthermia means your body temperature is too warm. So notice dilated pupils, that would be a sympathetic effect. The blurred vision comes because you also block the ability of the lens to focus. And now you have the effects that are not at all like sympathetic, the flushed skin and hyperthermia. What happens is that if you block the ability to sweat, the only way your body now can cool down is by moving blood to the surface. Same reason that in a car you have the radiator up front, with a little fan where the air will blow past it and cool down the water. So your body will move blood to the surface to try to cool it, and that's why people with anticholinergic syndrome look red, and they're running a high body temperature. Rapid breathing, tachycardia, meaning fast heart rate, dry skin, dry mouth, urinary retention. All those are basically sympathetic, with the exceptions of the ones that I colored a little bit differently, okay? And there's a little kind of a memory device that they teach medical students and nursing students and everybody else in the world who has to learn this. Mad as a hatter, blind as a bat, red as a beet, dry as a bone, hot as a hare. All right, mad as a hatter, you're confused. Blind as a bat, pupils are dilated and they can't focus the lens. Red as a beet, all that blood is up on the surface. Dry as a bone, you can't sweat, you can't spit. Hot as a hare. So hares, like jackrabbits, run a slightly higher body temperature than humans do, where they may run like 99, 100, something like that. So your body temperature is more like that of a hare, okay? So there you go, mad as a hatter, blind as a bat, red as a beet, dry as a bone, hot as a hare. If I ever ask you on a quiz or an exam to tell me anticholinergic effects, don't tell me the memory aids. I won't count those correct. Those are just to help you remember the actual things, okay? Here's a whole slide on this, all right? Just to try to explain it all. I'm not going to run through it here in the PowerPoint. If I were you, I would take some time, go over this. Notice there are lots of natural, there are plants, like out here in the desert, Jimson weed, datura, deadly nightshade. A lot of people will take these plants intentionally to get high, and they end up with anticholinergic syndrome. So look over that slide. It explains a lot. You're going to be quizzed on this. True or false, the sodium-potassium pump moves 3 sodium ions into the ISF. Do you know the answer to that? You should. What is it? That's true. Remember, interstitial fluid is a type of extracellular fluid. The sodium-potassium pump moves sodium ions into the extracellular fluid. So that's true. Okay? All right. We have one more PowerPoint to get through to talk about the rest of the ANS and electrolytes and fluids and solutes.